Teaching the Brain to Read, Strategies for Improving Fluency, Vocabulary, and Comprehension. Successful Reading Comprehension. Page 126. The reading proficiency of adults in the United States has declined in the past decade to the point that only 31% of adults tested in 2003 could perform complex and challenging literacy activities. Kuttner, Greenberg, Jin, Boyle, and Shu, 2003. With the current emphasis on phonics-heavy reading programs and decodable books aimed at practice and use of the phonics-heavy curricula, there is an associated delay in children's exposure to rich, meaningful, personally relevant, and enjoyable literature in the classroom. Many teachers enhance unstimulating decodables by reading aloud from engaging books to show children that learning to read is a worthwhile goal and written material can be wondrous and exciting. After students do learn to understand the individual words they read in texts, new brain areas need stimulation and practice to recall the words long enough to understand complete sentences. The information from the beginning of a sentence or preceding sentences in a paragraph must be kept accessible while the next segment of text is read. Students also need practice storing and retrieving the content of sentences so that they can comprehend pages, chapters, and finally entire texts. Reading difficulties can interfere at each step of the comprehension process. For example, to comprehend a story, the reader has to continually recall the preceding words, sentences, and pages in the story. Page 127. For some students, the process of decoding consumes so much of the brain's metabolic activity that there appears to be an inadequate flow of oxygen and glucose to support the metabolism in the brain's cortical areas of memory storage. Without the ability to connect each new word, sentence, or page with those that came before, children cannot build a comprehensive understanding of the words they read. Long and Chong, 2001. Goals of Reading Comprehension Strategies. Strategies to build comprehension are available to increase neural efficiency at each step of the comprehension process. Skilled readers comprehend more successfully than less skilled readers because skilled readers use strategies such as activating background knowledge to comprehend text and to draw valid inferences about what they have read. Dixon, Simmons, and Kamianui, 1998. They also differ from unskilled readers in their ability to decode fluently and accurately. Perfetti and Bolger, 2004, Velutino, Fletcher, Snolling, and Scanlon, 2004. The neuroimaging and neurocognitive research about reading comprehension covers how the brain takes in new information through a variety of neural networks using patterns, categories, and relational connections, and builds the new data into comprehended knowledge. The strategies that influence the brain's metabolic neural activity and the regions involved in this processing of raw data into stored, comprehended knowledge will be described, including engaged learning, personal connection, background knowledge, meaningful context, prediction, critical analysis, and metacognition. As comprehension increases, so does appreciation of reading for both knowledge and pleasure. Constructing meaning from text or spoken language is not a separate literacy skill, but a merging of all acquired prior knowledge, personal experience, and vocabulary with the strategies of deductive and inductive reasoning and making connections. Page 128. To be successful at reading comprehension, students need to actively process what they read. That processing skill requires that students have automatic reading skills and fluency, necessary vocabulary, and text-appropriate background knowledge. Successful comprehension is augmented when students have practice with strategies for monitoring their understanding, increasing their intrinsic interest in the text, and creating goals and purpose for their reading. To comprehend text, the reader must be able to decode words or recognize words and access text integration processes to construct meaning and retain the content of the words long enough for it to stimulate their stores of related information in their long-term memories. Cunningham and Stainovich, 1998. Beginning comprehension instruction builds on children's linguistic and conceptual knowledge. Snow, Burns, and Griffin, 1998. And includes explicit instruction on strategies such as summarizing, predicting, and self-monitoring for understanding. Learning First Alliance, 1998. Additional comprehension skills that must be taught and practiced include assessing and connecting with students' background knowledge, reteaching of new vocabulary, clarification of key concepts, linking to prior knowledge and personal relevance, instruction and strategies, teacher-guided and student-centered discussions about the content, previewing, predicting, summarizing, selecting main ideas, self-monitoring, and teacher feedback for understanding. Snow, Burns, and Griffin, 1998. The boy at the lighthouse would not have been willing to climb a single step if, at the very base of the staircase, he could see the hundreds of steps that awaited him. However, even at his most fatigued, if he were coaxed to see if he could climb a single step, isolated from that daunting staircase, he would have tried and succeeded. The approach I use is to first guide students to access their individual comprehension competencies and then to help each student establish challenging but achievable reading comprehension goals. Page 129. Comprehension motivators. Just as motivation and engagement are the keys to students persevering through any of the early reading skills that are frustrating, these also are the cornerstones of the strategies I use to connect students to reading comprehension skill acquisition. I plan strategies that resonate with the affective filters and dopamine pleasure release to stimulate student motivation and engagement through connections and use texts that are relevant and therefore interesting to my students. When I plan my pre-teaching or previews, I keep in mind the goals of connecting to students' previous positive experiences, real-world applications, and personal interests, as well as captivating their interest through novelty and imagination stimulation, helping them construct goals for their reading, and supporting them as they strive for realistic self-challenge. The previewing and motivating process begins with activating prior knowledge, building connections, establishing goals for reading with purpose, and pre-teaching information needed for successful comprehension of the particular text. Activate prior knowledge. Prior knowledge activation starts with what I know about my students from observation, assessments, conversations, parent and student conferences, information from previous teachers, peer interviews, and interest inventories. I use this knowledge to select books and to help students relate a new book to their lives, interests, backgrounds, and prior knowledge. Fluency practice helps students recognize words when they read them. Similarly, when students are prompted to recall prior stored knowledge, they may stimulate related neural networks as they consciously look for links in their prior knowledge to events, people, and places in the story. Page 130. Strategies include: activate students' background knowledge through discussions about interesting topics that will be included in the book before they read it. Let students who already know something about the topic or author share their experiences and insights with classmates so these student experts feel engaged and their enthusiasm builds interest among their classmates. Continue to activate prior knowledge even after the book is started to sustain student goal-based and motivated reading. Every few chapters, use pre-reading sessions that include questions and prompts related to additional prior knowledge that becomes pertinent during these later parts of the book. Big picture first. Before reading a text that will offer an achievable comprehension challenge, all students, and especially global learners, benefit from some preview of the big picture. This can serve to prompt prior knowledge, stimulate personal interest, demonstrate real-world value to the reading, and guide students to develop personal goals that will keep them connected to the content of what they read so the information will go from working memory to long-term memory. Big picture exploration can start even before formal prediction or KWL activities by having discussions or activities related to the topic of the book. Guest speakers, videos, art projects, field trips, current event stories in newspapers, cross-curricular connections, and journal or quick writing prompts about the topic can all build student engagement and motivation. These priming activities will hopefully start the stimulation of brain categories that will be pattern templates for students' brains to recognize, encode, and transport new information to connect with the stored patterns. Page 131. Pre-reading. Pre-reading prepares students for the content, focus, organization, and level of difficulty of challenging comprehension material. The goal of pre-reading is to give students an overview of the topic, book, or story to be read so they can develop mental templates upon which to pattern the new information. Pre-reading can include activities to build interest and attention, explore keywords, create connections and background knowledge, and establish reading goals. Build interest and attention. Just as discrepant events can be powerful motivators for students to actively think during science lessons, they also work in reading. Ask questions about the book topic that piques their interest or offer tantalizing but brief descriptions of the theme or story organization. Reading a surprising or intriguing passage from the book can be the start of a discussion that allows students to give opinions as to what it might mean and in what context. This discrepant event builds insights they can use later in prediction activities. Students are using frontal lobe executive function cognition when they look ahead, predict, anticipate, analyze, and evaluate, making adjustments as they read. Another advantage of observing how students respond to preview activities and information is discovering more about their learning styles. For example, if a child is successful at reading previewing, this strategy can be suggested for difficulties he is having in working through math problems. He can be shown how to use lecture or text cues to preview and predict what information is important to study for a test. Explore keywords. Pre-instruction in the vocabulary words that students need to stay comfortable and connected to the text has been discussed in the previous chapter. Page 132. For textbooks in social studies, science, mathematics, or grammar, keywords are often found at the beginning of a chapter. In literature you may need to pre-select keywords as you plan weekly vocabulary lists. Build connections and background knowledge. After giving students with prior knowledge opportunities to connect with their knowledge and using the big picture to engage others in the topic, more can be done to include the remaining students. To bring all students up to the level of background knowledge needed, consider the suggestion of Vygotsky, 1978, that learning always proceeds from the known to the new. When teachers provide background knowledge before students read, story comprehension improves. Kinzer and Liu, 1997, Sharp et al., 1995. Prepared students have more equal footing. As you provide this background knowledge through cross-curricular thematic lessons, videos, and directed instruction, you can keep students engaged with open-ended discussions that help students make connections between the information and their own interests. To bridge the gap between text and students, consider classroom activities that connect with the book they will read. If they will be reading about a leader of a colony during the colonial period in the future United States, a pre-reading discussion can start with making a class list of the qualities they would want in the leader of a colony they would select to join. Students could volunteer to be mock candidates using a set of platform policies about colony goals and governing. Classmates can have a debate about whom they support as a candidate or which platform appeals to them. As students start to read the book, they will have investment in seeing which characteristics and policies were supported in the book and how things turned out. Establish reading goals. As with any unit of study, even after students see the big picture, it is motivating for them to know why the book is important enough to be worth their effort. Page 133. In addition to the real-world interests and connections they develop during big-picture activities, consider how each student in the class can develop personally meaningful goals to keep him or her engaged and focused during the reading. When part of their goals include finding information to support their predictions or to answer their questions, students approach the reading with more motivation. Their goals can give them a purpose for reading, encourage them to monitor their comprehension, and stimulate active thinking as they read. It helps to make the correlation between the successes students had when they worked toward previous goals. It is motivating when students see their comprehension skill levels increase in response to their practice, just as they recognize that success correlated with their practice in sports, musical instrument rehearsal, keyboarding, or learning multiplication tables. Have students discuss goals of what they want from the book, both in terms of knowledge they want to acquire and comprehension skills they want to build. They can write down questions they want the text to answer and information they seek independently even before the formal KWL activity. For some students, goal-directed reading will occur automatically. For other students with limited comprehension, focus, or English language skills, you will need to check in with them for more formal discussions of goals. Possibly, you will work with them on their individual charting of goals, practice, and achievements as you continue to remind them of their previous successes with practice leading to proficiency in things they had an interest in mastering. Predicting. One of the most popular and brain-compatible forms of predicting is the KWL chart. This strategy gives students opportunities to activate prior knowledge as they consider what they know about the subject, prior knowledge, what they would like to learn, goal, and later, what they comprehend and learned. KWL activities chart a course for student goal-directed reading that can motivate comprehension. Page 134. Students not only want to acquire the information they seek, but they are personally invested in seeing if their predictions and those of their classmates on the list of what I think I know are correct. To make this activity more personal, students can first work alone to create their own K and W parts of the chart. After class discussion and creation of a class KWL chart that can remain up throughout the reading of the book or story, students can add the element of personal engagement through choice by adding to their personal lists the K and W statements and questions posed by classmates that resonate with their own brains. Another type of prediction to use before the class begins reading a new book or chapter is a non-graded true, false, multiple choice, or fill-in-the-blank prediction page. On this page, students respond based on their own opinions to questions that will be answered as they move along in the story. This strategy is designed to keep students' reticular activating systems and effective filters primed to seek out the information that will confirm or refute their predictions so they are motivated to follow the story through personal engagement. Because students keep their own prediction pages, they can give themselves stars or make corrections in their responses as the story progresses and class discussions clarify the answers. When they predict correctly, this may encourage them to share their prediction reasoning with the class because they built confidence from their correct predictions. Although students are always encouraged to state or write reasons for their predictions, once the class discussion takes place following the unfolding of the plot, students can continue with the mental manipulation to build executive function and long-term memory by adding more data to the evidence they list in support of their prediction. By correcting incorrect predictions in their papers, students will have practiced writing the correct comprehension response and have that information to study when they need it to write a paper or take a test. Page 135. Extending comprehension strategies. Comprehension lessons can also achieve specific objectives beyond students' understanding of the meaning of the words they read or hear. The added goals can include cognitive manipulation of the information by actively processing it through executive function and higher cognitive activities such as considering the information in another context, making interpretations, discovering new personal connections or connections to previous films or literature, using information acquired to modify their predictions, analyzing and comparing characters and interpreting their relationships and motives, inferring causes and effects, summarizing the plot, deducing the theme or author's message. As the lessons progress, consider listing which comprehension objectives you are working toward during the day's discussion or activity so students become consciously aware of how skilled readers interact with text to build comprehension, knowledge, and engagement. Students can be encouraged to refer to the class list that is developed as they participate in lessons with one or more of these goals of comprehension. Comprehension strategies modified for better brain fit. When I began to keep track of the strategies I use and how they might be modified to be compatible with my understanding of the ways the brain reads, I found it most useful to structure strategies for the specific comprehension goals I had for each book. Page 136. I realized that my comprehension goals depended on the content of the book. Previously, I had followed a rather formulaic system of using almost the same strategies in the same sequence to help students summarize, describe, interpret, contrast, predict, associate, distinguish, or generalize. Now I use the strategies best suited to my goals for student comprehension. Consider prioritizing your comprehension goals for each book you use and then select the strategies you find most pertinent to those goals. You can use these strategies in the order that seems best suited to the book you are working with. Summarizing. Summarization connects reading and memory by linking understanding of text to remembering. This strategy makes sense as an introduction to incorporate before beginning the other strategies for several reasons, some not brain-related. For example, students may not have done the reading homework, may have been absent for several days of class reading, or may have special needs that benefit from hearing summaries of what was read. Students who are having trouble with summarizing can build up to story summarizing through scaffolded practice. Students can start with a summary of events such as weekend activities or sporting events. They can record their summaries and compare with classmates to see how accurate and precise they were. As students practice summarizing text, remind them to refer to the text to support their opinions and inferences. They may realize they need to take notes to help them with summaries. If students have trouble with summarizing or recognizing the main idea in a paragraph or story, they can practice summarizing familiar stories from other books they read or stories they have heard multiple times. Summarizing movies or television shows can also scaffold text summarizing. Students can also practice finding the main idea of paragraphs or pages. A list of guiding questions can be provided to start them off, such as, who is the subject of the paragraph? And what is the most important information or most important thing described in the page or paragraph? Page 137. Students may find it helpful to write margin or reading log notes while they read to summarize key points after reading longer passages. Students can be given written prompts as questions to consider as they first summarize plot and then deduce theme. Questions they can first write responses to and later ask themselves as they read include: who is the main character and what important things has he or she done so far? What plot information relates to things the main character did? What qualities does the author seem to think are good or important in people? Has there been any conflict and resolution so far? What does this information suggest to you about the author's message, reason for writing the story, and therefore, the theme? Summarizing can help students at all levels of comprehension when it precedes the class discussion about other parts of the text analysis. The class discussion can be orchestrated so students can contribute to summaries at their individual comprehension and language levels. I structure these summary discussions by selecting or encouraging volunteers whom I believe will describe the basic outlines before I call on students who I know will add depth to the summary. Compare and contrast. Comparing and contrasting helps students make associations between elements of story, character, setting, and theme. Student personal connection to comparison. Contrast activities can include debates where students choose sides and support their selected character's point of view. Then they can switch roles and support the contrasting character's perspective. Students can discuss the similarities and differences between their lives and those of the characters. Page 138. Comparisons and contrasts are beneficial both within the context of the book and with reference to previous reading, stories, or real people. This activity is well suited for analytical learners and allows all students opportunities to manipulate information through executive function. Venn diagrams can be added to the compare-contrast activity. Identify, building personal relationships with content. Comprehension is defined as intentional thinking during which meaning is constructed through interactions between text and reader. Harris and Hodges, 1995. Readers can derive meaning from text and build ownership of what they read and hear when they actively relate the ideas to their own knowledge and experiences and construct mental representations with personal connections as they read. Make inferences and ask questions. Making inferences can engage problem-solving thinking processes that build interest. Asking themselves questions as they read can add additional information for students to seek as they read with the purpose to find the answers. Other questions can become points of class discussion. Self-monitoring. Self-monitoring requires students to learn to stop periodically to take notes of the words they do not understand or parts of the plot that don't make sense. Students can use timers or signals from teachers to stop at periodic intervals or at appropriate breaks in chapters or subchapters to monitor their own conceptual understanding. Page 139. Through instruction, modeling, and practice, students can also be taught to stop periodically to construct mental images and do independent summaries of their understanding of the action or character development every few pages. When students become more experienced, they can transition to making their own inferences, predictions, and mental notes as they read. When students have difficulty remembering to stop for this self-monitoring, I have had them use sticky notes every designated number of pages so they remember to stop and self-monitor. Depending on the comprehension strategy they are working on, they may also jot down the words that confused them, their inferences, or a few words of summary. These are not formal notes to be saved for reference, but rather prompts to use for the comprehension activity they are working on with the self-monitoring strategy. Teacher modeling of comprehension strategies. Teacher modeling of comprehension strategies helps students learn how to identify which strategies are most useful for different comprehension tasks and types of text. Although some strategies are acquired informally, explicit instruction and strategy application can make their use more clear and increase the likelihood that students will use them correctly and independently. Some of the benefits of modeling may coincide with the research described in Chapter 1 regarding mirror neurons. Just as mirror neurons suggest that watching an action activates the same neurons as are activated when the subject performs the action, students may be building neural connections by observing the modeling of the comprehension building technique. When modeling the comprehension strategy, the goal is to make the strategy explicit. Speaking your thinking aloud while also writing steps down offers the information to students through two sensory inputs. When you stop before demonstrating sequential parts of a multi-step strategy, you can make comments such as, "I'm using self-monitoring now to see if I understand why this character did something that doesn't make sense to me." Page 140. "I thought he was going to help his friend, but the note he wrote to the teacher seems to be something that would get his friend in trouble. I wonder if I missed something about the story or about this character's motives. I will go back to the part where he talks with his friend and see if I can clarify my comprehension. I think I need to make a timeline because the author seems to switch between past, present, and future. I don't know the word hearth, but it sounds like something in the house that is warm, maybe a fire pit or a cooking place. I'll read the sentence again with the word fireplace instead of hearth and see if it makes sense." Students may benefit from seeing the use of the strategy with material with which they are already familiar so they are comfortable and are successful with the strategy the first time they practice with it. They can then do teacher-guided whole class activities using the strategy related to the class text. During the modeling transition stage, you can do the activity with volunteer student models who have practiced their presentation with you first. Through repetitions of the task, students take on more and more of the responsibility, and the reason for the strategy is reviewed several times. The next step is for students to practice in pairs and independently on material especially for them from the text. Frequent monitoring of student practice with feedback continues to ensure that all students are practicing the strategy correctly. Independent work can continue, but at the conclusion all students record the strategy and their impression about how it worked for them and when they might use it again. This becomes part of a continuing personal strategy list that is added to during metacognition activities and becomes a resource for future independent reading comprehension. Page 141. Graphic or visual organizers. Graphic or visual organizers include maps, webs, graphs, charts, frames, and clusters. Visual displays can increase comprehension, organization, summarizing, prioritizing, memorization, and analysis by helping students construct and visualize relationships. Graphic organizers are compatible with the brain's process of patterning information for recognition, transportation along neural networks, and storage in categories. There are visual organizers that coincide with most of the previously described strategies for facilitating comprehension and memory. As younger readers develop the skill of predicting or previewing by looking at parts of the book, graphic organizers can help them chart the relationship between headings, subheadings, and chapters. Deducing the main idea from supporting evidence for plot or character comprehension can be visually contextualized with graphic organizers. These visual organizers help students recognize the patterns of subplots and family relationships as they translate text into visual displays. Examples of graphic organizers. Venn diagrams can be used to compare or contrast information from two books, such as two by the same author or about similar topics. Venn diagrams can compare two or more parts of a book, such as characters or settings. Timelines can order events within a text in the sequence in which they occur. Students can practice by making timelines for their favorite activities or of other things they do in sequence, such as making a sandwich, dressing for team sports, or turning on the computer and logging on to their level of play on a computer game. They can also make timelines of their lives from birth to current age with branches for important events. Page 142. Story webs can be written on a graphic organizer with questions based on want-to-know or predictions after previewing but before reading the book. The web adds to students' goal-directed connection to reading and focuses comprehension. Branches or spokes around the book title can include the questions they posed during the KWL or other prediction activity, such as, what does the title have to do with the book, or story? Where and when does the setting include the places on the map of Middle-earth in the front of the book? What evidence is there that this book is historical fiction? Who are the main characters? Why is there a picture of a boat on the cover? Why is there an illustration of a sad boy? Why is he sad? Encourage students to look for the answers to the questions as they read the story. When individual students find answers, they can add them to their webs and at the end of the reading session share them with the class and be encouraged to give reasons for their answers. Students can add ideas they agree with on the class list to their own lists. These can become ways to review the story before subsequent reading sessions or before the test or writing assignment. Free websites offer downloadable templates for visual, graphic organizers, such as www.edhelper.com, weblinkorganizers.htm, or you can purchase computer software programs such as Inspiration, Kidspiration for K-5 students, http://www.inspiration.com weblink, or SmartDraw, www.smartdraw.com. After modeling, assisting and instructing students to do complex cognitive tasks such as guiding them through these strategies and actual, concrete activities engages them in purposeful, carefully scaffolded learning processes focused on challenging learning tasks in their zone of proximal development, ZPD, the cognitive region just beyond what the student can accomplish alone. Page 143. With enough assisted practice, the strategy then becomes part of the student's internalized reading comprehension repertoire and enters his zone of actual development, ZAD, what he can do alone and unassisted. Practice occurs through reciprocal reading or partner or pair reading comprehension activities. Reciprocal reading for comprehension. Reciprocal reading allows students to work in their ZPDs without anxiety. After the teacher models the strategy and reminds students about the importance of mutual support and encouragement, students have the opportunity to take the role of leader in this small group activity. After someone reads a portion of text aloud as the group follows along, volunteers give oral summaries, and the leader encourages other group members to add information. Depending on what strategy is being practiced, the leader then encourages the group members to suggest possible predictions, draw comparisons, make inferences, describe personal connections to text, or pose questions to consider as goals for the next reading section. Peer teaching. Assessing students' understanding by asking if they have any questions is often inadequate. Sometimes students think they understand when they do not actually understand. Other students may have questions but feel too much anxiety to ask questions in whole class or even small groups. Peer work can provide a lower stress opportunity for students to share their understanding. For a partner who has a clear comprehension, Teaching the information to a classmate reinforces the knowledge by reactivating the neural circuits where the knowledge is stored. The verbal communication of knowledge requires more structured thinking and gives the student another opportunity to process the knowledge and executive function to reach an even higher level of understanding. Peer work in comprehension is preceded with modeling and practice in active listening such that students share their own ideas only after paraphrasing the ideas expressed by their partner. Page 144. When peers are well paired and practice active listening, the level of challenge, support, and meaningful feedback can be individualized for achievable challenge so students experience accomplishment without frustration. Lists of comprehension questions suited to the book and strategy being practiced can be given to the pairs to guide their discussions. The other partner can also explain vocabulary words that may have been confusing to one partner. The partner share will give more students confidence to join in a subsequent class discussion. Even for those who don't feel ready, the partner share will be a review and that added engagement with the previously confusing material will help them get more connected as active listeners to the ensuing class discussion. After partner sharing, students can work together to add more information to their ongoing graphic organizers. Independent activities. Independent comprehension activities such as papers, projects, or original graphic organizers can give students opportunities to demonstrate their comprehension and their improvement. This is also the time for students to chart their individual comprehension goal progress or write in their literature response logs so they can experience the dopamine pleasure response to recognizing their growing skills and feel encouraged to persevere. Literature log. Literature logs are personal journals where students respond to the book. Initially, I provide prompts, but when students become more independent they are encouraged to respond to parts of a book they select as personally significant or interesting. Student response to some literature may be very personal, so I offer students options to keep sections private. One approach is to permit students to fold over and tape the private pages so you can see the amount they wrote but still respect the privacy of their reflections. Page 145. Consider using literature logs to pull students in through their comfort and interest zones, thus lowering their affective filters so new information can penetrate their amygdalas, connect with personal and relational memories, and be consolidated and stored as long-term memory. In their logs, students are prompted to include quotes, paraphrase conversations, and briefly summarize parts of the plot that cause them to pause and think. Asking students to select the sections that are most meaningful to them supports student comfort and resonance. Prompts to encourage personal connections include the following suggestions. Which character reminds you of someone you have met or something about yourself? Write about a time when you faced a problem similar to one confronted by a character in this book. How did you react? Did reading this book give you any ideas about what you might have done differently in your own experience? Describe a situation when you have been surprised, frustrated, frightened, angry, sad, or confused like the character in the book. Note-taking for comprehension. Modeling. As with most activities where new strategies are employed, consider modeling the strategy of selecting what text information is important enough to warrant note-taking. When the class is of the right age and responsiveness level, I've worn a baseball cap as I model places where I would take notes. I read the text aloud and project it on an overhead or from a computer onto a television monitor. When I come to a phrase or section that I think is fairly important for students to include in their notes or that it is critical to the theme, plot, or characterization of the story, I turn the cap sideways and say a few words about why I am noting this section of text. Page 146. When I read a passage that has very important, noteworthy information, I completely reverse the cap and do my think aloud. After this type of modeling, I may select appropriately skilled student volunteers to read the next passage in front of the class. To support the volunteers, I may stand in the back of the room and rotate the cap to prompt them when they come to text that should be included in notes. The student can then write the notes as she sees fit on the overhead projector, and I invite classmates to add note points. After adequate modeling, I have let the students try note-taking in pairs as they reread text we have already read and discussed. This can be part of the paired reading or peer teaching activity. After the pairs finish, volunteers share lines from their notes as classmates add to their own notes the information they did not include initially that I confirm as noteworthy. Question-making as note-taking. Students can build on their goal-directed reading by adding questions they seek answers to as part of their daily notes. Keyword notes. Students who are overwhelmed by writing summaries about reading can start building the note-taking strategy by simply listing 3 or 4 key points or copying several sentences they feel are keys that unlock the meaning of what they just read. They can then add to their notes with information from classmates' notes I have copied, with permission, for students who need this support. Note-taking and note-making strategy. To increase personal connections and relational memories, students can respond to the comprehension notes they take. Strategy modified from one described by Schmeck, 1988. Steps for this strategy. 1. Draw a line down the length of the paper about 1/3 of the way in. 2. Write notes about the text on the left side. Page 147. 3. Make notes on right side with questions, comments, similarities, and personal connections. Some student responses to literature logs and note-taking include: I pay more attention to what I read when I take notes. Because I have to decide what is important enough to write down, I am actually thinking about the information, and that helps me remember it better and follow the story more easily the next time we read. Before I write it down, I usually try to understand what it means. Sometimes when I don't understand, the note-taking makes me look up words I don't understand or reread confusing parts. After I take notes, I am able to know more for class discussions. If my notes are good, it saves me from having to reread the whole chapter before a test. What this list of student note-taking benefits reflects is the brain processing I interpret as taking place when students' brains actively respond to the information they read. My goal is for students to exercise and develop their highest frontal lobe executive functions. When students summarize data as notes, they are making judgments and engaging in critical analyses when they effectively delete or merge information. My goal is for them to make connections and develop skills of relational memory making and patterning. Memory and comprehension. Working memory. Active working memory is used when students retain the information from the beginning of a paragraph or chapter while reading the last sentences. Working memory is what lets students keep track of the beginning when they are trying to read and comprehend the end. Working memory keeps information in the conscious mind for about 20 seconds. Page 148. New information, or just the passage of time, moves information out of working memory unless it is processed by active manipulation or patterned into connections with prior knowledge and existing stored categories of information such that the working memory becomes long-term memory. Memory is also classified as implicit or explicit, with distinctive neural pathways seen on fMRI scans. Explicit memory includes memory of people, objects, places, facts, and events. These are processed as short-term memories in the prefrontal cortex. If they are manipulated through executive function and built into relational and long-term memories in the hippocampus, explicit memories are then stored in the parts of the cerebral cortex that correspond to the sense that first received the sensory input. For example, auditory input that becomes long-term memory is stored in the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe, adjacent to the sensory intake area for response to sound. Implicit memories are of skills, habits, and conditioning, and do not appear to be processed in the hippocampus, but rather in the cerebellum, striatum, and amygdala. Kandel, 2006. Functional MRI studies have investigated the hypothesis that comprehension requires the reader to remember what has been read so it can be connected to new information and integrated with prior knowledge as the reading of a story continues. Long and Chong, 2001. Strategies I use are designed to build memory storage and retrieval skills to enhance reading comprehension. Goals for strategy use in building memory for comprehension. Build patterned links to prior knowledge. Increase flow of comprehension information through the amygdala by lowering the affective filter with low stress and high interest activities so the information has a more efficient pathway. Page 149. Infirmary study scanned subjects predetermined to have low or high working memory on cognitive testing while they read sentences with ambiguous syntax. Participants read sentences with either a short or long region of temporary syntactic ambiguity while being scanned. The perisylvian region of the left temporal lobe and Broca's area in the left frontal lobe were identified as most active when subjects processed the syntactically ambiguous portion of the sentences. These same brain regions had previously been found to demonstrate high neural activity during working memory processing. The researchers believed that the activation of these same brain regions during specific tests for both working memory and syntactic analysis suggest that there could be a correlation between these two functions such that strategies that are structured to improve working memory span could benefit reading comprehension, especially of syntactically complex text. Friedrichs, Vo, and Friedrichs, 2004. I have incorporated interpretations from this and similar studies and strategies I use to strengthen students' comprehension of complex text such as highlighting, note-taking, and summarizing strategies. Through the amygdala to the MTL, medial temporal lobe, and the higher cognitive functioning regions of the prefrontal cortex. Increase consolidation of information into students' long-term memories without the negative influence of high circulating cortisol to interfere with the storage and retrieval of this information needed for reading fluency. McGaugh, McIntyre, and Power, 2002. Highlighting, note-taking, review, and rereading can re-stimulate newly formed patterns recently consolidated in the MTL and strengthen the long-term memory circuits in the neocortex. Page 150. Memory building activities. Reading Comprehension Quiz Show. The Reading Comprehension Quiz Show game involves as many teams as there are small reading groups. For younger children, the groups are monitored by aide, teacher, parent assistant. Older students can be more independent, with adults as circulating observers. After a predetermined amount of text read around by the small group, from a page to a chapter depending on length and student ability, all students write a question and answer on a note card. The question is about something in the text just read and will be used later in the contest when groups compete to answer questions about the whole book. I start with the modeling and student practice of creating good questions after a whole class reading of a page. I read a variety of what I consider good and poor questions and have students discuss why some questions might be too specific or too vague. I then have them suggest questions of their own and receive group feedback on these. Before students do the question-making activity in their small reading groups, they practice or are reminded how to also give positive feedback as group members take turns reading their questions and answers aloud. Instead of the group deciding a question is not good enough to be used or that the answer is incorrect, they practice working together to improve the question so its originator has the satisfaction of having contributed a good question to the final contest. At the time of the contest, which can be held several times over the course of a book that takes the class several weeks to read instead of just at the book's conclusion, I select the most reasonable comprehension review questions with the explanation that I took parts or ideas from each group member's questions to create the final ones I constructed. Page 151. Mnemonics. Mnemonics use the pattern-seeking brain action that looks for associations between the information it is receiving and the information that is already stored. If the brain can find a link to a pattern or existing category, the new information is more compatible with storage in long-term memory. Especially at the beginning of a book, where a number of locations, characters, and subplots are introduced without inherent meaning, students can practice creating mnemonics as organizational frameworks on which to hook new information. One useful strategy is to list the names of the characters on a chart that can remain up during the reading of the book. Students can suggest character traits that are presented early in the book and that start with the same letter as the first letter of each character's name. A mnemonic can be created with the names and traits, such as, sarcastic Sally told timid Tina that brave Brian is looking for dishonest Dave. Mnemonic acronyms can be used to aid comprehension of places where the action takes place in sequence. After making a timeline putting the settings in sequence, the first letter of a memorable word describing each setting can be written next to the setting. A real or nonsense word can be constructed from these first letters, as is done in the mnemonic Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, or PEMDAS for the order of operations in math computations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. For the locations woods, attic, lake, tree, east gate, and road, my students created the mnemonic Walter. MOVES is a mnemonic acronym I created for my students to use when they review reading material for comprehension assessments. Each letter reminds them of another way to review the information through alternative sensory processing systems to stimulate multiple neural networks and strengthen long-term memory. Page 152. Move, manipulate. Move around and use a physical action to remind you of a character's traits or a setting. Alternatively, manipulate models, dolls, or stuffed animals to act out important plot information. Organize. Create graphic organizers such as timelines and character charts to review important details. Visualize. Visualize characters, settings, and plot progressions in your mind so you'll have a visual network to link to when you want to retrieve text information. Enter. Enter the information you want to remember by typing it into a computer or writing it by hand. This combines tactile and visual memory. Say. Read the material aloud. Reading your notes or important passages aloud adds auditory memory to your networks of comprehension. Demystifying text. Whatever reading level students are at, there will always be some text that is challenging. A strategy that will help them reach their highest independent reading comprehension levels is not one of simplifying the text, but of demystifying it. When students learn to deconstruct text and see that even the most complex text is composed of simpler elements, the task of comprehension becomes less daunting. Note-taking and highlighting. As described earlier, note-taking helps students keep track of what they read so they can reinforce the memory and also refresh their memory before beginning the next reading section, or when preparing for written response to literature or tests. Highlighting is a common technique, especially in coursework with factual information such as history and science, page 153. Modifying a strategy developed by Professor Sheridan Blau of the University of California, Santa Barbara. I have students use colored markers to increase comprehension of complex text. Blau demonstrates the strategy with a poem and the instructions that students read the poem 3 times. Each time, students are instructed to underline anything they don't understand. The first underlining is in yellow, next in light blue, and third in green. A modification without markers is to underline first in dotted lines, second in dashes, and last in uninterrupted lines. Blau suggests that strong readers think about what they don't know and pay more attention to what is worth thinking about. Blau, 2003. During the process, students understand more of the poem each time they read it. The process of underlining appears to focus attention on the phrases students initially underlined because they are especially confusing. When students return to these lines, they are obliged to focus on them, and that activity appears to help them build comprehension skills such as concentration, persistence, and courage in the face of intellectual difficulties. Willis, 2005. Lesson consideration: for this strategy it is ideal if students own their own copies of the book so they can do the highlighting in the text. Even if funds don't permit purchase of books for students who would benefit from being able to place marks in their books, there are often books that have been removed from class circulation because the cover is damaged or they have water damage. Several such damaged books could be separated into sections such that the salvageable sections become available for students who need them. I have also made copies of difficult portions of the books for students to use for this highlighting strategy practice. In some cases, when particular students need more scaffolding, the activity can be done as partner work with a classmate. For more challenged students, the highlighting can be done in advance by a parent, aide, or teacher. Page 154. I start early in the year making copies on overhead paper, placing the clear overhead projector paper over the copy and modeling the 3-color marker process myself before doing it as a whole class with volunteers. I next have students work individually and share with partners or small groups using poems. After they develop confidence and begin to trust and enjoy the process, we move on to complicated passages from primary source history books and then to literature above their independent reading levels and individualized for the student's ability. The strategy even works with conceptual parts of science texts. When I have used this strategy, some students have found it so useful they ask me to photocopy pages from their textbook reading homework that they did not understand during independent reading. This would be quite time-consuming if it was needed for all students reading all year. But as one would expect, as students become adept at the process, they are also developing their higher levels of comprehension, thinking, abstraction, and conceptualization. They discover that they can achieve the same degree of understanding by focused rereading. The end result is that they learn the material they need for those standardized tests, but because it is not processed through superficial rote memory, but rather relational and conceptual thinking using higher-level executive function skills, the learned material becomes part of their long-term memory available for retrieval and subsequent critical thinking connections far beyond test day. I have seen the work these students have produced years after they leave my class, and I believe that Blau's strategy and a set of highlighters brightened their comprehension processing. I have found this process helpful with students at all reading comprehension levels. Students appear to develop their focus, patience, and reading frustration tolerance because the process itself is enjoyable, colored markers, and the success is immediately evident, less underlining each time because with rereading more is understood. Page 155. When Oberlin College Class Dean in Study Skills and Reading instructor Melissa Ballard used this strategy in her Effective Reading Strategies course with an Emily Dickinson poem, she wrote to me about significant improvement in every student's written responses and in the quality of whole class discussions of the poem. She reported that her students seemed much more confident and even discussed how they might apply this strategy in classes as diverse as economics, Chinese, and biology. In Ballard's class, students began by talking about the feelings they bring to the reading task, and some students were forthcoming about being bad at poetry or literary analysis, especially 19th century writing. One young man who had made that admission earlier in the year ended up being a major participant in the Dickinson discussion after using the highlighting strategy. When Ballard asked him if this seemed inconsistent, he said, "Maybe I've been underestimating myself." Metacognition for comprehension. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. Metacognitive strategies can be taught to help students mentally process the information they read and to recognize what they can do to build future success. Metacognition can be used when students first preview the book, to clarify their purpose for reading, and to set reading goals. As students read, metacognition strategies can help them recognize what they do or do not understand. Comprehension metacognition practice can be prompted by directing, modeling, scaffolding, and practicing to help students identify what they do not understand and select the best individual strategies to resolve their comprehension difficulties. Instructions to prompt student metacognition. Stop periodically and consider if you understand what you just read. Try to summarize the information. Check what you are reading against what you already know. Page 156. Make predictions about what is to come, and continually construct and revise a sense of the whole out of the parts. Identify the comprehension problem. Is it a confusing vocabulary word, difficulty recalling past information about the character named in the passage, confusion about what happened previously that connects with the current action? Consider the strategies you have used before. Look up the vocabulary word, check your graphic organizer or timeline, look back through the text, look ahead to see if the information in the next page will clarify your confusion. After repeated experience with their metacognitive strategies, students become more comfortable moving among the different strategies for different purposes. Metacognition is reinforced if after using a successful strategy students write a brief note on a list they keep of strategies that will serve them well in the future. These can be shared with classmates in whole class discussions and added to class strategy lists.